Next is Ben Blair, who holds a PhD in philosophy and education from Columbia University. He is a co-founder and president of New Lane University, a radically affordable and flexible online liberal arts university. Ben is a former board member and president of the Mormon Transhumanist Association, and is a co-author with his wife, Gabrielle, of the book The Kids Are All Right, Parenting with Confidence in an Uncertain World. Ben and Gabrielle have 6 children: Ralph, Maud, Olive, Oscar, Betty, and Flourishing. With that, Blair.
Thank you. So you may have seen, or you may have gathered that like Lincoln and Chris and Carl were part of the founding members of the MTA. I wasn't. So you'll notice a step down in quality from like the original founders. Okay. So our conception of God matters because the God we imagine shapes the way we live. And I'm using God broadly to include ultimate standards or aims for any individual or society. Our conception affects us and others, even if you or your society identifies as atheist. A definition of God is never only an abstract exercise. It influences what we admire, what we trust, what we hope for, and what we are willing to give our lives to. It can help determine whether humanity devotes its highest intelligence and efforts to developing weapons of war or medicine, whether we see our highest calling as withdrawing from the world into cloistered holiness, or working to lift oppressed populations and heal suffering in public life. What we worship or regard as ultimately worthy directs our moral energy and collective aspiration. A God worthy of worship must be more than conceptually coherent. To be worthy of worship is to be worthy of devotion, love, imitation, and ultimate loyalty. It is to name that reality which not only explains existence, but also calls us toward the highest possibilities of truth, beauty, goodness, creativity, compassion, and human flourishing. So I'd like to explore how different historical conceptions of God do or don't meet this. And I can't believe the great fortune that some of these names have already been dropped. So Aristotle's conception is effectively a God of the logical gaps. For his metaphysical scheme to work, there needed to be a mover that moved everything else, but was itself unmoved, hence an unmoved mover. He writes, "There is then something which is always moved with an unceasing motion, which is motion in a circle. Therefore the first heaven must be eternal. There is therefore also something which moves it." You see the logical connection there. "And since that which moves and is moved is intermediate, there is something which moves without being moved, being eternal substance and actuality. The first mover then exists of necessity. And insofar as it exists by necessity, its mode of being is good. And it is, in this sense, a first principle." Aristotle's conception of the first mover gives the animating engine for everything else. Its goodness is simply a logical consequence for Aristotle of its necessity. Instead of turtles all the way down, there's a first mover that is not moved, but moves everything else. Different from Parmenides, Aristotle argued that change is real, and different from Plato, Aristotle argued that the most real things, primary substances, change. Aristotle thinks motion, change, and causation are real and must be explained. But if every motion required a prior mover in an endless chain, then the system can't be logically explained. It can't be turtles all the way down, so Aristotle says there must be something at the top that moves other things without itself being moved. It's a logical fill-in. Importantly, Aristotle was not mainly trying to describe a God of worship. He was trying to solve a metaphysical problem, and to do so, he needed something with 2 combined features. It causes motion in other things while remaining unmoved itself. A logical stopgap, and yet it gave us some key concepts and terms that have had staying power in our conceptions of God, such as fully developed, fully actualized, eternal, unchanging, and the centrality of contemplation. Anselm moved the conception beyond Aristotle's logical fixed gap to God whose definition was itself a proof of God's existence. Anselm's ontological proof begins and ends with a definition. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. The key in this definition is not merely that God is the greatest being we can think of, but that God is the kind of being beyond which no greater being can even be conceived. Once we grasp this idea, we're thinking of a being such that any attempt to conceive of something greater would fail, because that would no longer be God. This doesn't work for anything else but God. That cat, horse, chair than which nothing greater can be conceived does not prove the existence of cat, horse, or chair God. Anselm then argues that even someone who denies that God exists can still understand this definition in the mind. But a being that exists in reality is greater than a being that exists only in the understanding. So if this being, than which nothing greater can be conceived, existed only as an idea in the mind, then we could conceive of something greater, namely that same being existing not only in the understanding, but also in reality. So the definition that put God only in the mind would contradict the definition, since God is supposed to be the being than which nothing greater can be conceived. So Anselm concludes that God cannot exist only in the understanding, but must also exist in reality. Therefore, Anselm concludes, God exists. Anselm's argument is a key section of every medieval philosophy or philosophy of religion course. In the past, I've found it repugnant because it feels so abstract and begins and ends with a definition that contains an argument. It feels like it's just a matter of grammar and semantics. But I've come around some and think it's an elegant formulation, even if it feels clunky to say the first few times. But I'd say its elegance is a key reason for its staying power, and I'd argue that it is valid. That is, if we accept the premises, we must accept the conclusion. This conception suffers from a familiar bone to pick in conceptions of God, which is arguing from the preaching standpoint of, guys, God is really, really, really great. In classical Christianity, Jesus is understood as God made flesh, not merely a prophet or moral teacher, but the divine itself entering human life. The central claim of the Incarnation is that in Jesus, full divinity and full humanity are united in one person, so that God is revealed in a human life, death, and resurrection. Joseph Smith did not originate the idea of theosis, but he gave it a distinctive power and clarity. In his teaching, God is humanity's eternal parent, and God's children are meant to grow into godhood. And to repeat the phrase that is maybe required in several presentations at every MTA conference, we've got to become gods, the same as all others have done before. God is the parent of humanity and the revealed image of humanity's highest destiny. Rather than imagining God chiefly as distant, dominating, or bound up with sacrifice and death, Grace Jantzen points toward a conception of God oriented around natality, flourishing, and the creation of life-giving and life-sustaining possibilities. On this view, what is most divine is that which calls persons and communities into fuller life. This fits the timeline I've presented in the slides, though maybe it fits better after the Jesus as incarnation slide, since Joseph Smith worked to collapse the distance between the human and the divine. But inasmuch as Mormon and Christian conceptions of God tend toward emphasizing sacrifice, death, power, scripture, contemplation, and distance, as opposed to natality, flourishing, creation of life-giving and life-sustaining possibilities, and inasmuch as there's a certain escape velocity to moving conceptions dominated by intentional or unintentional patriarchal frameworks, Janssen's is a welcome corrective. The new God argument, we've also heard, I think, in every presentation so far, is not a definition of God, but I think it does offer a conception of God that anticipates and gives us a starting place to articulate a God worthy of our full and unreserved worship. Canon recasts God in transhumanist terms. If humanity may become superhuman, and if superhumanity would create worlds like ours, then it is reasonable to trust that a more compassionate superhumanity created ours. This conception reinterprets God as superhumanity and looks at the logic of exaltation as a prospect of virtuous superhumanity. I imagine this conception appeals to some, if not a majority, of the participants in this retreat. Critically and powerfully, Canon bases this conception on faith in humanity. And I'd like to propose a definition that is perhaps the start of an argument, but makes no argument about God's existence, but follows and draws from these different conceptions. God is that than moving toward which no greater vision of humanity can be conceived. I don't think this conception sacrifices or diminishes or contradicts the greatness of God in Aristotle's unmoved mover, Anselm's ontological proof, classical Christianity's incarnation, Joseph Smith's eternal father, Jantzen's emphasis on natality and flourishing, or Canon's creative, compassionate superhumanity. This conception begins with the conviction that humanity must be the actor of concern. Aristotle's God and Anselm's God have been prominent and lasting conceptions of ultimacy, but they remain largely removed from human life. Likewise, many religious conceptions so emphasize the greatness of God apart from humanity that they can diminish what we can or must do, leaving us to wait for rescue rather than take responsibility for our future. It's obviously a reworking to resemble Anselm's formulation, but by contrast, on this view, God names the highest horizon of human becoming. The point of the concept is to focus and elevate human agency. God is the ideal that may inspire and orient human effort. The vision calls humanity forward, and the measure against which our collective aspirations should be judged. That's the key value of this conception of God, and in a practical and moral sense, it always was or always should have been the central locus of our conception of God once we recognize God as at least a projection of our hopes and aspirations. One of the most dangerous and contested differences between Mormonism and much of contemporary Christianity, and perhaps increasingly a prominent strand within Mormonism itself, is the tendency to treat worship as a ritual reinforcement of an unbridgeable distance between God and humanity. I suspect I'm in agreement with some of you when I say I reject that view. Worship, at its best, is not flattery of power, nor the admiration of distant greatness. It is the offering of one's full devotion to that which is most worthy to orient one's life. I propose that a God conceived as that than moving toward which no greater vision of humanity can be conceived is worthy of worship. That God is not a rival to human flourishing, nor a substitute for human responsibility, but the highest horizon of both. And if it is an argument, it's a practical one that requires action to prove. To worship such a God is to bind ourselves to humanity's greatest conceivable end and to live in faithful movement toward that. The Mormon Transhumanist Association is uniquely positioned to articulate and enact such a conception of God. I think we've heard great examples already of just such doing. And also to critique conceptions of God that tend to diminish human responsibility or separate humanity's development from our understanding of God. I think something like this definition and conception can act as a critique of such diminishing conceptions. The MTA has helped and can continue to help join a theology of exaltation with a disciplined commitment to human flourishing, orienting our thought and action toward humanity's highest conceivable end, a frontier that will change and evolve as our moral, physical, and technological horizons expand. Thank you.